Hello, good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutan.
Welcome to Consider This. Now, we're going to continue our three-part series on the government's economic and social plan known as Shared Prosperity. And this is, of course, ahead of tabling of Budget 2020 on Friday. So joining us on the show tonight is Lawrence Todd, who is the Director of Research and Development at the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as IDEAS. It's a think tank that supports free market principles and small government. Welcome to the show, Lawrence.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so let's talk about shared prosperity. I want to get a sense from you of what you think this shared prosperity document's purpose is. I mean, I'm thinking about it and I'm just wondering who it's targeted for. Is it a political document? Is it targeted to policymakers, the business community, or the public? Who do you think it's for?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that a lot of people have been calling for the government to sort of set out a clear vision. And that's included the business community, actually. I think there was a lot of discussion kind of after the election, running into the end of last year, about the government needing to set out what it was going to do differently. So I think there's been quite a lot of anticipation for this big moment where the government unveils that vision. I think then of what's happened in the sort of months in between since the election is, of course, the kind of the political dynamics have changed. You know, we've seen the kind of the opposition realigning around a kind of new kind of re-emphasizing on a different economic narrative. So I think in response to that, you know, the shared prosperity has had to sort of tack into that to address it. But I think kind of where it leaves us is that, you know, overall, I think the shared prosperity vision document that was published sort of sets out these sort of broad ideas and sort of government's broad thinking on certain issues, but doesn't quite get us into the policy detail that I think, you know, for example, the business community probably was hoping for from this kind of big strategy statement.
Yeah, but they have said wait for the Malaysia plan for that kind of detail.
Sure.
But I do want to ask you about, when we say the government, it seems that the government perhaps is also slightly schizophrenic, and it's been said that this policy document was authored essentially by Institute Masa Depan Malaysia, which is a Bersatu think tank, not in consultation with the rest of the sort of party-linked think tanks or even with the political parties. It's essentially a Bersatu document and describes or reflects the orientation of Dr. Mahathir and those around him, which re-emphasizes affirmative action and the Bumiputra policy against, say, somebody like Anwar Ibrahim, who's been arguing against that and saying we need a different way of approaching the Malaysian story. Do you see that in the document? Do you see this? Because there's a lot of talk.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's clearly there in it. I think there's clearly that political direction to it, which you can also see in sort of the way it was presented and kind of brought out. But look, I think it's fair to also say that the document does try to go broader. And I think, you know, what I would welcome in it is the focus on these sort of different aspects of inequality that have kind of developed in Malaysia over the years. So a much greater emphasis than we've seen kind of, well, it has been there historically, but a really great emphasis on the kind of regional disparities. A bit more of a nuanced approach to looking at income inequality, a recognition, you know, in the past we sort of only ever looked at the Gini inequality measure, but that actually has sort of fallen short. And I think, you know, a key example of that is that, you know, the relative income gap between T20 and B40 has actually, you know, reduced, but the absolute gap has increased. Okay. So, for example, imagine that, you know, before, you know, I earn 1,000, you earn 2,000, you earn twice what I earn, but the gap is 1,000. But now if you earn 5,000 and I earn 3,000, you know, you don't earn double what I earn, but you earn 2,000 more. So I think that's why, you know, in the past, the previous government used to keep just publishing the Gini coefficient and saying, look, inequality is going down, inequality is going down, inequality is going down. But what was happening was relative inequality was reducing, but the absolute gap in incomes was growing. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration came from in the last election. So I think, I get what you're saying, and I think it's true. Clearly there's a political agenda here as well. But I also think there is some genuine effort to widen the scope of challenges the government's addressing.
Okay, so what you've been speaking about is the redistributive justice motif that's part of the Malaysian story, right? We talk about the need to bring everybody along, and shared prosperity as a catchphrase is very compelling. But there's an other side to it. Because we're a capitalist economy, largely, and open, that growth is a very important thing. And it's always been growth with redistribution, right? Yeah. And growth with justice. Where's the growth in this story?
Yeah, the document is lacking the growth aspect.
Yeah, you know, I actually think that's a really key question, because if you look at the sort of story of Malaysia's development, I mean, it was remarkable progress, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, fueled with a welcoming approach to foreign investment, an industrial boom, export-led growth. The sort of problem now is that a lot of those low-hanging fruit have been picked, right? So now the challenge is for Malaysia, how do you find that sort of competitive edge, that growth and innovation and productivity? Because that's the reality of where future growth in Malaysia is going to come from. The problem with that is it's much harder to deliver that kind of economic growth through a highly centralized strategy.
Right.
So if you're just looking to really kind of build up your industrial capacity, the government can be quite effective in terms of saying, right, we're just going to bring all this investment in, blah, blah, blah. But when you're looking for, you really need lots of small companies trying different things, trying to kind of hit on the next innovation that can be profitable. That's very difficult for the government to do from a sort of highly centralized point of view. So I think this sort of central problem is that the government still wants to pursue this top-down approach, crucially because it still has this redistributive agenda. But the demands of Malaysia's economy in terms of where growth is going to come from don't really align with that sort of tactic. So I think that's a basic tension that I think actually, Prime Minister Najib tried to manage that with the new economic model, and it kind of fell flat a bit. And it's the same tension playing out now.
Well, so you mentioned that this policy, this paper, Shared Prosperity, was trying to focus on a different aspect. It was the government trying to show how it was going to do things differently. Where do you see the differences between in this kind of shared prosperity broad thinking compared to, say, Najib's administration previously?
Well, I think, as we touched on earlier, at the moment, because we don't have the sort of policy detail, it's difficult to know. I mean, like a really big picture example would be on trade policy. So we still don't know whether or not the government wants to ratify the CPTPP, which is the trade deal that's already been negotiated. RCEP, which is the one that's currently being negotiated, the assumption is they are going to ratify, but there are question marks raised there even. So when it comes down to these nitty-gritty policy questions, or in that case not even that nitty-gritty, quite big picture policy questions, we just don't know. So the only thing I think we can compare on is like broad narrative. And as I say, I think the attempt with shared prosperity is to broaden the narrative to look at different aspects of inequality, whilst maintaining that central focus on development of the Malay economy at its core.
Okay, all right, we're going to continue this conversation in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan, and on the show with us we have Lawrence Todd from the think tank Ideas. Now, Ideas recently put out a position paper on making shared prosperity a reality ahead of Budget 2020, and they made some interesting proposals. I'd like to talk to you about some of the proposals and the problems that they are trying to address. So first of all, the idea of having or proposing a new living wage tax credit. So this is to address the problem that minimum wage is not enough, not sufficient, but yet increasing the minimum wage would be an imposition or difficult for some businesses to implement. So tell us a little bit about this proposal.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think you set out the context perfectly. I think we see that there is this problem of low pay in Malaysia. Actually, when you compare Malaysia internationally, it seems there's this sort of structural problem in people getting paid relative to how much they produce. So if you produce $100 worth of goods in the US, you might get paid, say, $60, whereas in Malaysia, if you produce $100, you might get paid $30. And that gap is particularly bad in the lowest paid sectors. So therefore, you'd say, well, we need to raise the minimum wage. But on the flip side, we also know that our SMEs are really squeezed, business investment is tight. So how do we kind of find a middle path between those two constituencies?
I wonder sometimes maybe this document ought to have been called a shared reality vision, because I don't know we actually have a shared or common perception of the Malaysian economy. It seems like a lot of people, and in government as well, seem to have a very different idea or different ideas about how the economy works. And we look at, for instance, the recent debacle over Food Panda and those interventions, right? Does government intervene to create or enable, or are they there to micromanage? I mean, so on and so forth. I mean, how do you see some of your proposals, your ideas proposal? I mean, where does it come from? And what understanding of the Malaysian economy do you have?
Right, so I think the general picture would be this, which is that we need to transition in Malaysia from a model where the government directs the big moving parts of the economy to create outcomes that it wants, to a system whereby the Malaysian government sets the rules, regulates the market, and then allows that process to then evolve more naturally. I think that's where we need to get to from the prosperity perspective in terms of where future growth is going to be driven in the Malaysian economy. At the same time, we have to recognize that we need to get that shared bit as well, right? So we have to build rules that are fair for everybody. So another proposal that we put in there was, or two linked ideas perhaps. Firstly is to reform the tax system and to introduce a capital gains tax. Now, this is quite controversial in the Malaysian context. This has been raised before.
Yes. Business communities might not be,
And some part of the M40 as well. I mean, it seems like
right.
the most neglected of the constituent parts of Malaysia.
Or most squeezed part.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
equally squeezed or squeezed in different ways is the M40, right? I mean, is there anything in the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030 for the M40?
Well, look, I think from our perspective, I would say that, so what we've tried to think about is, okay, right, at the bottom end, we want to increase wages. And hopefully that would have an impact up the distribution, up into the M40. At the M40, I would say one of the key issues is actually, rather than income distribution, it's wealth distribution. So we see very high concentration of wealth among the very, very richest. Something like 22% of Malaysia's GDP is controlled by like the top 40 people. So a real skew to the top. So for the M40...
Not top 40%, but just top 40
people.
Individuals.
Individuals, exactly.
Right.
So what we've talked about in our position paper and our recommendation to the government is, okay, how do we maybe try and release or encourage Malaysia's wealth to be allocated directly to employees? So we're looking at incentive schemes for employers to give shares essentially to their employees. Now, I think in practice, this is probably a policy that would benefit the M40 rather than the B40, because it's probably going to be for employees in larger companies, right? So I think what we're trying to look at there is, how do you address wealth distribution? Because we've got to look at both the income side and the wealth side. So I do think there is this need for shared prosperity to provide, at the very bottom, we're talking about poverty eradication. A little bit higher up, we're talking about raising incomes. A little bit higher up than that, we're talking about, improving savings and wealth. And then right at the top, we're talking about a little bit more tax.
Okay. So on that note, I'd just like you to finish your thought from earlier about your proposal of having kind of two-pronged, right? So having this reform of the tax system and this capital gains tax. I believe the finance minister has already come out to say no new taxes in budget 2020, but the reality is the government needs revenue, and the tax base in Malaysia is undeniably small. So how do we address those kind of conflicting ideas?
Yeah, well, look, I think, actually we published a follow-up paper to this actually only this week, where we focusing just on tax. And we reiterated the point there about a capital gains tax and how we think it can be consistent with a kind of pro-growth model, because you rein in some of the speculative investment when the economy is overheating, and then you also have this cushion to encourage investors not to pull out their capital when the economy is slowing down. So it kind of keeps Malaysia in what we call a growth corridor. Probably the other thing we could look at doing, and I know this is quite controversial, is the reintroduction of the GST.
Why do you say that this is something we should look at?
Well, look, actually as ideas we were quite torn on this, because as economists we think the GST is the right policy, but as Democrats we know that the public is opposed and therefore it has to be abolished. So what we would encourage the government to look at now is, how could you address some of the concerns? So I think, coming back to what you were saying, which is, how much of this problems fall on the M40, what's in shared prosperity for the M40. I think one of the objections to GST was that was a tax that largely fell on the M40. It was the people who are buying. So how can you introduce some fairness into it? So we're looking at having higher rates for luxury consumption, for example. So like under the SST, actually things like lobster, quinoa, salmon are all 0 rated. But actually if these were subject to a higher rate, 15%, 20%, so that you kind of geared the GST a bit more to the higher income households.
Is lobster 0%?
Yeah, exactly. So there's actually a lot that you could do, just tightening up the current system, I think.
Okay.
But if you geared more fairness into the tax system, I think you'd also get greater democratic consent for it. And then you don't have this problem of seesawing with the tax system. So.
I wonder if we could just, for a moment, look at the external environment that Malaysia, and to what extent does the Shared Prosperity Vision document even acknowledge the external environment in a way that is sufficient? Because we have regional competitors, nobody has to come either buy from Malaysia or invest in Malaysia. What is addressed in that document?
I think probably the current vision is quite narrow in that respect. I don't think there's enough recognition of Malaysia's position in the world and how the global economy is changing. And I think that there are risks for Malaysia there, because you've got people hot on the heels in terms of being able to compete on the basis of low labor costs and all those kind of areas, but Malaysia's sort of struggling to move itself into that sort of top tier of development. Now, of course, the Shared Prosperity Vision does talk about increasing kind of value add industries, moving up the value chain in these export sectors. But I think here more than anywhere else, it really comes down to, okay, but what specifically are you going to do? Because there are choices.
Right.
So we've talked about the trade deals already. There are still a number of quite large investment restrictions that apply in Malaysia that could be looked at. Of course, the role of the GLCs, the government-linked companies, is a very significant issue when it comes to how Malaysia is viewed by investors and so on. So it feels like this is a relatively narrow document, and its focus is largely domestic, and it's to a degree relatively blind to what's happening out in the wider world. Of course, there are
but
general
it's not a fatal flaw. I mean, to be blind to the general environment in an open capitalist economy is an extraordinary oversight, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe blind is too strong. I mean, I think the central goal of the document, which is about trying to, have a more highly educated workforce, more technology adoption, all these things are great, but they're great as goals. The question is, are you going to take the hard choices in policy terms? And I think that's also where, looking at how the global environment is changing. I mean, so one example is, when we talk about infant industry protection, so of course in the case of the national car, the way global manufacturing has changed so much even since the 80s, it's so much more integrated now. You can't just wall yourself off and say, we're going to build this one thing really well and protect it from all the competition and then unveil it when it's ready, because global production has become so integrated. Right. So actually it's much more important now to find your niche within the supply chain and then develop from there, rather than try and hive yourself off and just focus on one product. So I do think there's this lack of reality maybe when it comes to how Malaysia integrates with the broader global economy, and a lack of clarity on these kind of big policy questions around trade and investment.
Okay, we're going to come back and continue that look on the lack of clarity and also the realities of the Malaysian economy heading towards Budget 2020 with in full view of the Shared Prosperity Vision. We're going to continue that conversation in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with us on Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you, and on the show we have Lawrence Todd from the think tank Ideas. This is just, of course, ahead of Budget 2020 and the tabling of Budget 2020 on Friday, and ahead of that we want to kind of get your thoughts on where we're at, where the economy is at right now. So the fiscal situation of Malaysia heading into the tabling of Budget 2020 is one that is quite limited, and you spoke just before the break about the government needing to make those hard decisions, right, Lawrence? But how much wiggle room do they have to make those hard decisions given the tight fiscal situation they're in?
Well, I think, as you say, the position is quite tight. The operational deficit expanded in the last budget, so I don't think there's a lot of room for manoeuvre. There's a bit of a backlog, actually, still of promises from the manifesto that haven't been implemented. And obviously, largely driven by the kind of global environment, there's talk of a recession, although we shouldn't talk that up too much or it will definitely happen. And that always leads to calls for fiscal stimulus. I think my one note of caution there would be, I think any fiscal stimulus should be quite well targeted to areas, either where there's going to be the most vulnerability or areas that create the conditions for growth longer term. So there's a lot of talk about, just kind of finding a bit of an extra development spending. I wouldn't be so keen on that.
Okay.
I would prefer, of course, I would prefer if the government looked at what we had proposed in the living wage tax credit, which is a form of fiscal stimulus, but that tries to essentially get more money into people's pockets, sort of increase the spending power, particularly of the B40,
right,
which I think would be a better way to try and stimulate the economy from a fiscal perspective.
So on that note, for the living wage tax credit, how is that to be funded? I mean, you have to think about those proposals and
Sure.
Where will the government find money to, can they afford to,
Yeah, I think my view would be that this can be funded through rationalizing the corporate tax incentives that we already have. So we have, I think, 70, 80 different tax incentives for foreign investors mainly to come in, and there's sort of specific incentives if you invest in this part of Malaysia and this part of Malaysia. And I think overall the Bank Negara calculated that cost probably 10 to 15 billion ringgits per year. But at the same time, the World Bank have found that 80% of investment decisions aren't based on these incentives.
They're not.
No. So I think a significant rationalization of those incentives and then a retargeting of that into a fiscal stimulus that really has impact, which for me would be kind of increasing spending power, increasing incomes a lot, horizontally across the B40, rather than sort of picking a construction project off the shelf, of which we have quite a lot already.
Okay.
So I think it's about finding the targeted stimulus.
Right, and for many of us, who are not economists and laypersons who've never touched a textbook on economics since A levels, which is a long time ago, I do want to ask you, some of the strategies that you hear coming out in the press include, selling of assets to kind of, and so on and so forth. Do you expect to see in this budget thinking about how government's going to get the money, if it's going to be based on, the price of crude, so on and so forth, going into the future? Do you expect that the government will think of divesting themselves? Since that's also something that
one of your proposals,
we've talked
right?
about.
Yeah.
No, I think when we talk about divestment, I think we need to distinguish between. I'm sure the government has assets that it could divest itself of, parcels of land, weird little companies it's acquired for whatever reason that it could look to divest, and then that money, yes, can be kind of offset against the debt. When we talk about the much more strategic issues of divestment, which is really what the government-linked investment companies, so Khazanah, PNB, what they might be doing, for me, this is not a discussion that links to the debt, because that money is not the government's money to spend paying off the debt. That's like the people of Malaysia's money. So I think the discussion there is more about what's the structure of the economy. Do we want to see such high government ownership? And how do we gradually transition from that? Now, as we transition from it, if that's what the government wants to do, pare down those holdings to try and stimulate the private sector, I don't think that money should be spent paying off the debt. I think it should be reinvested to generate long-term returns for Malaysian people, but that it should be a much more diverse portfolio, much more international in its focus. So for me, I don't pair the divestment question with the debt question so much.
Okay. Very quickly, I also want to just, we have a little bit of time before that, but I want to get your thoughts on what you're expecting out of of Budget 2020. Based on what you've proposed, how much are you expecting to see in Budget 2020 of this position paper from Ideas?
Well, the one thing I would hope they'd look most kindly on is the living wage tax credit, because actually if you go back to the Buku Harapan, they originally promised that they would subsidise half the cost of a rise in the minimum wage up to 1,500 ringgit.
Right.
So what we've proposed is what we think is a slightly more affordable way of getting a bit higher beyond 1,500. So I hope they'll look on that favourably. If I'm being realistic, I don't think they're going to countenance kind of massive wholesale tax reform of the kind that we're proposing in this budget, at least. I suspect what we'll see is a tightening of some tax. We saw a tightening of the SST with respect to digital services last year. I think we might see that applied to digital goods, or goods bought via digital platforms rather. So you might see these sort of technical changes, and then I suspect there will be some small fiscal stimulus, but my fear is it's a new development project somewhere, which I don't think would be the most impactful thing.
Okay.
And finally, I mean, in the last few minutes that we have, when you look at this government, the Pakistan Harapan government now in a year and a half or so, philosophically, do you see any distinction between them and how the Barisan National thought about the economy, at least in terms of domestic capital, foreign capital, and the role of the state in regulating all that?
I mean, to be completely honest, I think it probably is a bit more backwards leaning than the previous government in terms of openness to foreign investment, say, and to international trade. I think we see a slightly more instinct for this infant industry protection and sort of national development within Malaysia's borders rather than sort of letting things open up a bit more. So that's a general philosophy that seems to come through. But at the same time, you know, a lot of what the government actually says seems to be very supportive of you know, maintaining Malaysia's openness, which is, as you've said a few times, is the core of Malaysia's economic model. But when we actually get to the policies, I think the picture's a bit more backwards leaning.
All right, Lawrence, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today, and we await with bated breath on the what's going to come out, the tabling of Budget 2020 on Friday. That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan, saying good night and see you soon.